Nietzsche uses the word ressentiment deliberately, and he keeps it in French for a reason. There is no exact equivalent in German or English, because ordinary words like resentment are too shallow. Ressentiment is not simply anger, bitterness, or envy. It is a psychological condition produced by blocked action. At its core, ressentiment arises when a person is unable to discharge hostility outwardly. An insult cannot be answered, a wrong cannot be avenged, a rivalry cannot be acted upon. The emotion does not disappear. It is delayed, internalized, and stored. This delay is crucial. Ordinary anger explodes and passes. Ressentiment ferments. It lingers. It thickens. It becomes part of how a person interprets the world. Nietzsche insists that ressentiment is not a moral failing in itself. It is a response to impotence. Where action is possible, resentment burns off. Where action is impossible, it turns inward and becomes imaginative, interpretive, and moral. This is why ressentiment is inseparable from memory. The noble type, Nietzsche says, forgets easily, not because they are stupid, but because they can act. Their emotions resolve themselves in action and do not require preservation. The ressentiment type cannot forget, because forgetting would mean losing the only arena where victory is still possible, the inner world. Ressentiment, therefore, transforms emotion into interpretation. Instead of striking back, the injured party begins to reevaluate. The one who caused harm is not merely stronger or luckier. They are now bad. Eventually, they are evil. And the inability to retaliate becomes evidence of moral superiority rather than weakness. This is the decisive inversion. Ressentiment does not say, "I am weak." It says, "I am good because I am weak." What was once a limitation becomes a virtue. What was once an inability becomes a moral achievement. Nietzsche's insight is that this inversion does not happen consciously. The individual does not decide to lie to themselves. Ressentiment is creative. It genuinely produces new values. These values feel discovered, not invented. They feel morally obvious rather than psychologically necessary. This is why ressentiment is so dangerous. It does not merely distort perception, it reorganizes it. The world is reinterpreted in a way that makes one's own condition feel justified, meaningful, and even superior. Importantly, ressentiment is not limited to individuals. It can become collective. Entire moral systems can arise from shared conditions of powerlessness. When this happens, ressentiment stops feeling like a psychological response and starts feeling like moral truth. Nietzsche wants us to see that ressentiment is not hatred expressed openly. It is hatred that has learned to wait, reinterpret, and moralize. It is aggression that has lost its outlet and found a new weapon, values. Understanding ressentiment at this basic level is essential because everything that follows, moral inversion, guilt, the invention of evil, and eventually the ascetic ideal, depends on this one psychological transformation. Before ressentiment becomes morality, however, we need to understand how blocked action turns into delayed emotion and then into moral interpretation. Nietzsche insists that ressentiment begins not with thought, but with blocked action. Something happens, an insult, a defeat, an exclusion, a humiliation, and the natural response would be to act, to retaliate, to assert oneself, to push back, to leave, to dominate, to compete. Where this response is possible, the emotion burns off. It resolves itself in movement. Ressentiment begins where this movement is impossible. The reasons can vary. Physical weakness, social position, dependency, fear of consequences, internalized prohibition. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. The instinct to respond outwardly is arrested, but the energy does not disappear. It has nowhere to go. At this point, Nietzsche says, the psyche is forced to reroute the emotion. Aggression turns inward, but it does not simply become sadness or despair. It becomes interpretive. The mind begins to work on the injury, not to heal it, but to make sense of it. This is the first crucial step. The injury is no longer experienced as a brute fact. It becomes a problem requiring explanation. The question shifts subtly but decisively. Instead of "what can I do?" the question becomes "what does this mean?" And because direct action is blocked, the explanation must justify inaction. It must explain why retaliation did not occur and why it should not have occurred. This is where valuation begins. The person suffering resentment does not say, "I could not strike back." That would be an admission of weakness. Instead, the psyche asks, what kind of person would strike back? The answer that emerges is not neutral, it is condemnatory. The aggressor is redescribed as crude, base, immoral, dangerous. At the same time, the self is redescribed. The inability to retaliate is no longer framed as impotence, but as restraint. Inaction becomes patience. Fear becomes gentleness. Dependence becomes humility. What began as a limitation is reinterpreted as a choice. Nietzsche is very clear here. This is not deliberate dishonesty. It is not a conscious lie. It is a psychological necessity. The psyche cannot live with itself as merely powerless. It must transform powerlessness into value, or it collapses into self-contempt. This transformation requires time. Resentment is slow. It does not explode. It accumulates. Memory becomes central. The injury is revisited, replayed, and refined. Each recollection adds detail, motive, and moral weight. The past becomes a resource. Over time, the interpretation hardens. What was once a personal injury becomes a general judgment. The aggressor is no longer just that person. They become a type. Strength itself becomes suspect. Assertiveness becomes dangerous. Success becomes morally questionable. At this stage, resentment has crossed a threshold. It is no longer just an emotional response. It has become a value-creating mechanism. It produces concepts like evil, cruel, arrogant, and unjust, not as descriptions, but as moral classifications. The decisive feature of this mechanism is that it reverses the order of valuation. Instead of beginning with what one affirms in oneself, it begins with what one condemns in others. Identity becomes negative. One knows who one is by knowing whom one rejects. This is why resentment-based morality is inherently reactive. It does not create values from abundance. It creates them from injury. It does not ask, "What kind of life do we want?" It asks, "Who is responsible for our suffering?" Nietzsche believes that once this pattern is established, it becomes self-reinforcing. Each new frustration confirms the interpretation. Each act of restraint strengthens the sense of moral superiority. The psyche becomes invested in its own interpretation because abandoning it would mean facing the original impotence without consolation. This is the mechanism that allows resentment to move from private emotion to public morality. What begins as an individual psychological adaptation can, under shared conditions, become a collective moral worldview. To understand why this worldview is so durable, we need to examine one further element, memory, and why resentment cannot afford to forget. Nietzsche makes a claim here that sounds counterintuitive until its psychological logic is seen clearly. Resentment cannot survive without memory, not memory in the neutral sense of recollection, but memory as preservation of injury. Resentment requires wounds to remain open. For the noble type, Nietzsche says, forgetting is not a defect. It is a function of strength. When action is possible, emotions discharge themselves outwardly. Anger is expressed. Rivalry is enacted. Victory or defeat resolves the tension. There is nothing left to store. Forgetting follows naturally because there is nothing that needs to be carried forward. Resentment is the opposite condition. When action is blocked, the emotion cannot resolve itself. The injury must therefore be remembered because memory is the only space in which retaliation can still occur. The past becomes the arena of moral struggle. Nietzsche insists that this memory is not passive. It is active, selective, and interpretive. Injuries are not merely recalled, they are reworked. Details are sharpened, motives are imputed. The narrative becomes clearer and more morally charged with each repetition. This is why resentment produces what Nietzsche calls a long memory. The past is not allowed to fade, because fading would mean losing the moral leverage the past provides. Forgetting would reopen the original problem, impotence without explanation. Memory, in this sense, becomes a weapon. It allows the individual to keep the aggressor morally present, even when they are physically absent. The injury continues to act in the present through recollection, judgment, and interpretation. This is also why ressentiment moralities are historically oriented. They fixate on origins, debts, transgressions, and inherited guilt. The past becomes a moral resource rather than something to be overcome. History is not something to move beyond. It is something to accuse with. By contrast, the noble type's forgetfulness is not naivete. It is the psychological effect of resolution. Because conflict is enacted rather than stored, the past loses its grip. There is no need to cultivate grievance when power can be exercised directly. Nietzsche is careful not to romanticize this. Forgetting can be brutal, it can be indifferent, it can trample over others. But psychologically, it indicates a life that does not need to justify itself through moral accounting. Ressentiment-based memory works differently. It binds identity to injury. One becomes someone who has been wronged, and therefore someone who must remember. To forget would feel like betrayal, not of truth, but of oneself. This is why ressentiment cannot tolerate reconciliation easily. Forgiveness would dissolve the moral narrative that justifies the self. Letting go would mean giving up the hard-won sense of moral superiority that emerged from suffering. Over time, this attachment to memory reshapes perception itself. New events are filtered through old wounds. Neutral actions are interpreted suspiciously. Ambiguity disappears. The world begins to look hostile by default. Nietzsche believes this is how ressentiment moves from a psychological response to a worldview. Memory stops serving life and begins governing it. The past dictates the present. Interpretation replaces action. This explains why ressentiment moralities are so resistant to change. They are not maintained by arguments, but by emotional investments. To abandon them would require confronting the original powerlessness without consolation. Understanding the role of memory makes clear why ressentiment is so stable and so dangerous. It does not merely preserve pain, it needs pain to remain intelligible. From here, Nietzsche moves to the next transformation. How this preserved injury is converted into moral identity. How I cannot becomes I will not, and finally becomes I am good. That inversion is the heart of ressentiment. This is the decisive moment in Nietzsche's analysis. Ressentiment does not remain a private emotion. It completes itself only when impotence is transformed into virtue. What begins as I cannot must be reinterpreted as I will not, and finally elevated to I am good because I will not. Nietzsche insists that this inversion is not rhetorical. It is psychological. The psyche cannot endure itself as merely incapable. To live with oneself, limitation must be recast as choice. Constraint must be experienced as self-control. Powerlessness must become moral restraint. The first step is subtle. The individual no longer says, I cannot strike back. Instead, the thought becomes, I do not strike back because I am different. This difference is initially vague, but it already contains the seed of moral distinction. Inaction is no longer explained by circumstance, but by character. The second step sharpens the distinction. The question is no longer about ability, but about worthiness. What kind of person would retaliate? The answer that emerges is not flattering. The aggressor is redescribed as crude, violent, selfish, or immoral. Strength itself begins to look suspicious. At this stage, valuation has fully inverted. What was once admired, force, confidence, dominance, assertiveness, is now condemned. What was once a lack, gentleness, caution, endurance, humility, is now praised. The scale of values flips, not because life has changed, but because the interpretation of life has changed. The final step completes the transformation. The individual no longer measures themselves against what they lack. They measure themselves against what they reject. I am good because I do not act like them. Identity becomes negative. Moral worth is derived from opposition rather than creation. Nietzsche stresses that this is not hypocrisy. The ressentiment type genuinely believes in this moral identity. The values feel discovered, not invented. The inversion feels like insight, not compensation. That is why ressentiment-based morality is so convincing, even to those who suffer under it. This inversion also explains why ressentiment must invent the concept of evil. The aggressor cannot simply be inferior or misguided. They must be morally corrupt. Evil provides the contrast necessary to elevate weakness into virtue. Without evil, there is no moral victory. Once this inversion is complete, the original injury disappears from view. The narrative no longer begins with "I was hurt." It begins with "I am righteous." The past has been transmuted into moral identity. The wound becomes invisible, even to the one who carries it. Nietzsche believes this is the point at which ressentiment becomes culturally powerful. When many individuals share similar constraints, the same inversion can become collective. What began as personal adaptation hardens into moral law. Values become institutionalized. This is why ressentiment-based moralities present themselves as universal. They must apply to everyone, because their authority depends on suppressing alternative ways of valuing. If someone can affirm strength without cruelty, the inversion collapses. Moral inversion, therefore, does not merely change values. It changes the criteria of evaluation. Instead of asking what enhances life, morality asks what restrains it. Instead of celebrating excellence, it rewards harmlessness. Understanding this inversion makes clear why ressentiment is not a side effect of morality, but one of its engines. It shows how moral language can arise not from abundance, but from injury, and why such language feels compelling, righteous, and necessary. From here, Nietzsche moves to a darker development. Ressentiment does not settle for moral superiority alone. It seeks a form of victory, a revenge that can be achieved without action. That is the role of imaginary revenge. Nietzsche introduces the idea of imaginary revenge to explain how ressentiment achieves satisfaction without action. When retaliation is impossible in the real world, the psyche constructs a substitute arena in which victory can still be experienced. This revenge is imaginary, not because it is weak or trivial, but because it operates in the realm of interpretation rather than action. No blow is struck, no dominance is asserted, and yet the emotional payoff can be intense and enduring. The structure is simple. The one who caused injury is condemned morally. Their success becomes suspect, their confidence becomes arrogance, their power becomes corruption. In this way, ressentiment achieves a reversal. The very traits that once produced envy or fear are reinterpreted as evidence of inferiority. This moral condemnation functions as a delayed triumph. The injured party cannot change the past, but they can change its meaning. What once felt like loss now feels like insight. The aggressor may still possess power, but they have lost legitimacy. Nietzsche sees this as a crucial psychological victory. Ressentiment does not need to defeat the enemy physically. It needs to defeat them symbolically. Once the enemy is classified as evil, the ressentiment type experiences themselves as morally superior, regardless of material outcomes. This is why imaginary revenge is so effective. It cannot be taken away. External circumstances may change, but the moral narrative remains intact. The individual carries their victory with them in their interpretation of the world. Imaginary revenge also explains the peculiar pleasure found in moral judgment. Condemnation feels satisfying because it completes the inversion. It confirms that one's own suffering was not meaningless. It validates restraint as virtue. It affirms identity through opposition. Nietzsche is careful here. This pleasure is not sadistic. It is compensatory. It replaces a victory that could not be achieved in action with a victory achieved in meaning. But because it operates symbolically, it can repeat endlessly. Each new judgment renews the sense of superiority. This repetition is important. Ressentiment does not discharge itself in a single act. It requires continuous reaffirmation. Moral outrage must be refreshed. Enemies must be re-identified. Accusation must remain active. This is why ressentiment-based moral systems tend to produce a culture of vigilance. There is always something to condemn. There is always someone whose behavior threatens the moral order. Imaginary revenge requires a steady supply of transgressors. Over time, this dynamic reshapes attention. People become skilled at noticing faults, deviations, and violations. Moral sensitivity sharpens, but in a narrow direction. The capacity to admire, celebrate, or affirm weakens. Nietzsche believes this is one of the great costs of ressentiment. The world becomes legible primarily as a field of offenses. Meaning is derived from judgment rather than creation. Moral life becomes reactive rather than productive. This also explains why ressentiment is often hostile to forgiveness. Forgiveness would dissolve the moral narrative that sustains imaginary revenge. Letting go would mean relinquishing the hard-won sense of moral victory. Imaginary revenge is therefore not an endpoint. It is a maintenance mechanism. It keeps ressentiment alive by constantly renewing the interpretive framework that justifies it. From here, Nietzsche takes the next step. Once imaginary revenge is stabilized, it must be generalized. Personal condemnation becomes moral law. Enemies become types. Judgment becomes universal. That process leads directly to the invention of evil as a moral category. Nietzsche argues that ressentiment cannot remain personal. For it to stabilize itself, it must generalize. What begins as a judgment about a specific aggressor gradually becomes a judgment about a type. This is where the concept of evil is born. Evil is not merely a stronger word for bad. It is a moral classification that allows condemnation to extend beyond individual cases. Once someone is labeled evil, their actions no longer need to be interpreted contextually. Their motives are presumed corrupt. Their character explains everything. Ressentiment requires this move because personal condemnation is fragile. If the judgment applies only to one person or one event, it remains open to doubt. Generalization removes that vulnerability. Evil transforms grievance into principle. Nietzsche insists that this invention serves a precise psychological function. Evil provides a stable enemy. It allows ressentiment to organize itself around a permanent moral opposition rather than a temporary injury. The world becomes divided into the righteous and the corrupt, the innocent and the guilty. This division does crucial work. It relocates responsibility. Suffering is no longer something that happens, it is something caused. Someone must be blamed. Evil makes suffering intelligible by assigning it an author. Once evil exists, moral identity becomes clearer. One knows who one is by knowing who one is not. Moral worth is established negatively, through contrast. The more clearly evil is defined, the more secure goodness feels. Nietzsche emphasizes that this process depends on intention. Evil is not defined primarily by harm, but by supposed will. The evil person is imagined as wanting to cause suffering. This allows ressentiment to operate even in the absence of direct injury. Suspicion replaces evidence. This is why the concept of evil expands so easily. It does not require action. It requires interpretation. Inner states become morally decisive. Desire itself can be condemned. Even restraint can be suspicious if it hides the wrong intention. The invention of evil also marks the moment when morality becomes hostile to ambiguity. Complexity begins to look like excuse. Explanation begins to look like justification. Once evil is presumed, understanding becomes morally risky. Nietzsche believes this rigidity is not accidental. Ressentiment needs moral clarity to survive. Doubt weakens condemnation. Nuance threatens the moral narrative. Evil must therefore be absolute. This absoluteness explains why ressentiment-based moral systems are intolerant of alternative values. If someone affirms strength without cruelty, the category of evil blurs. If someone acts powerfully without malice, the inversion falters. Evil must therefore be defended aggressively. It must be taught, enforced, and protected. Moral language hardens. Disagreement becomes immorality. Critique becomes threat. At this stage, ressentiment has completed its transformation. It is no longer an emotion reacting to injury. It is a value system organizing perception, judgment, and identity. But Nietzsche does not stop here. He asks a further question. Who maintains this system? Who gives it coherence, authority, and direction over time? To answer that, he introduces a figure who does not rule through force, but through interpretation. That figure is the priest. When Nietzsche introduces the figure of the priest, he is not primarily talking about a historical profession or a religious office. He is identifying a psychological role, someone who knows how to work with ressentiment, organize it, and keep it from turning destructive in ways that would threaten the moral system itself. Ressentiment, left to itself, is unstable. It accumulates anger, envy, and hostility without outlet. If this pressure were released directly, it would shatter the very people who depend on it for meaning. The priest appears as the one who redirects this pressure rather than eliminating it. The priest's genius lies in interpretation. He does not remove suffering, he explains it. He does not abolish resentment, he gives it a direction. Instead of allowing aggression to turn outward, where it might provoke retaliation or collapse, he turns it inward. Nietzsche describes this move with brutal clarity. The priest tells the suffering individual, "You are not suffering because others are stronger. You are suffering because you are guilty." The enemy is no longer primarily outside, it is inside. The self becomes the site of moral struggle. This redirection is extraordinarily effective. By internalizing blame, ressentiment is neutralized as a social threat while being preserved as a psychological resource. People are prevented from acting violently against others, but they are encouraged to judge themselves relentlessly. The priest thus performs a stabilizing function. He saves the suffering from despair by giving their pain meaning, and he saves society from revolt by turning aggression inward. Ressentiment becomes manageable. Nietzsche insists that this is not cynicism. The priest often believes in the values he administers. His power does not come from deception, but from psychological insight. He understands that people need an explanation for their suffering more than they need relief from it. Through this interpretive framework, guilt becomes central. Suffering is no longer random or unjust, it is deserved. And because it is deserved, it becomes meaningful. Endurance becomes moral achievement. This is why the priest is not merely a parasite in Nietzsche's analysis. He is a symptom. He emerges wherever suffering is widespread and meaning is scarce. His success depends on real psychological needs. But the cost of this solution is immense. Once aggression is turned inward, the individual becomes divided against themselves. Instinct is no longer trusted. Desire becomes suspect. Life itself comes under moral surveillance. The priest also ensures that ressentiment becomes collective. Individual grievances are absorbed into a shared moral narrative. Personal suffering becomes evidence of universal moral truth. The values are no longer private coping mechanisms, they become law. This is how ressentiment hardens into morality. What began as a psychological adaptation becomes a system that governs conscience, judgment, and identity. The priest does not invent ressentiment, he organizes it. Nietzsche's insight here is unsettling because it reveals why such systems are so resilient. They do not merely oppress, they provide orientation, relief, and purpose. To dismantle them without replacing their function would be catastrophic. Understanding the priest's role clarifies why ressentiment cannot be overcome by critique alone. It is not sustained by false belief, but by fulfilled psychological need. From here, Nietzsche turns to the next step in the process. Once ressentiment is organized and moralized, it must be universalized. It cannot tolerate alternatives. Once ressentiment has been organized into a moral system, it cannot remain optional. Nietzsche is clear on this point. A ressentiment-based morality must universalize itself, or it collapses. It cannot tolerate the existence of alternative values, because those alternatives threaten to expose its psychological origins. If morality were merely one possible way of valuing, the ressentiment type would face a devastating comparison. Someone else might affirm strength, joy, or power without guilt. And if that affirmation were legitimate, the moral inversion would lose its authority. Ressentiment therefore demands exclusivity. This is why ressentiment-based moralities present themselves as objective, absolute, and universally binding. They do not say, "This works for us." They say, "This is how everyone ought to live." Moral disagreement becomes moral failure. Difference becomes danger. Nietzsche stresses that this universalization is not primarily philosophical, it is psychological. The ressentiment type needs their values to be compulsory because those values are compensatory. If they are merely optional, the compensation fails. Universal morality performs a crucial stabilizing function. It removes comparison. If everyone is bound by the same standards, no one can appear superior in a way that threatens the moral narrative. Excellence becomes suspect, exception becomes immoral. This is why ressentiment moralities are deeply uncomfortable with hierarchy, not because hierarchy is always unjust, but because hierarchy reminds people that differences in capacity exist. Universal moral rules flatten these differences by declaring them irrelevant or immoral. Nietzsche sees this flattening as a defensive maneuver. By insisting that everyone is equal before the moral law, ressentiment protects itself against the humiliation of comparison. Difference is reinterpreted as injustice rather than fact. Universalization also explains the missionary impulse of ressentiment-based systems. They do not merely wish to live by their values, they feel compelled to spread them. Converting others confirms the righteousness of the system and neutralizes threatening alternatives. This impulse extends beyond religion. Nietzsche sees it at work in secular moral movements as well. Wherever moral seriousness demands conformity, wherever dissent is framed as moral deficiency, ressentiment is likely operating. Another consequence of universalization is moral surveillance. If values apply to everyone, everyone must be monitored. Attention shifts from creation and action to compliance and judgment. Moral life becomes regulatory rather than aspirational. Nietzsche does not deny that universal moral systems can reduce harm. His point is deeper. When morality is driven by ressentiment, harm reduction becomes inseparable from life reduction. The highest value becomes safety, predictability, and restraint. Universal morality also prepares the ground for guilt. If everyone is bound by the same moral law, then everyone is perpetually failing. This failure sustains the priestly function. Guilt renews dependence on interpretation and consolation. At this stage, ressentiment has fully matured. It is no longer recognizable as a reaction to powerlessness. It has become a worldview, one that appears moral, reasonable, and humane, yet is fundamentally reactive. But Nietzsche insists that this worldview comes at a cost. The cost is not immediate cruelty, but long-term psychological strain. Living permanently under moral surveillance produces anxiety, self-doubt, and exhaustion. To understand that cost, Nietzsche turns to the inner life of the ressentiment type, to what it feels like to inhabit a moral world built on inversion. Nietzsche insists that ressentiment does not merely reshape values, It reshapes inner life. Once moral inversion becomes dominant, the individual does not simply judge the world differently, they begin to experience themselves differently. The first cost is anxiety. When morality is universal, inward, and intention-focused, the individual is never finished. There is no point at which one can say, "I have done enough." Motives are always suspect. Desires are always ambiguous. Even restraint can be questioned for impurity. Moral life becomes open-ended in the worst sense. This produces a constant background tension, a feeling of moral insufficiency without a clear object. The individual feels watched even when alone. Judgment has been internalized. What once came from outside now operates automatically from within. Nietzsche describes this as self-surveillance. The person becomes both accused and prosecutor, instinct and interrogator. Spontaneity feels dangerous because it bypasses moral inspection. Action is delayed by interpretation. The self fragments. This fragmentation has consequences. Energy that might have gone into creation, risk, or assertion is redirected into monitoring, justifying, and explaining oneself. Life becomes cautious, desire becomes hesitant, confidence feels irresponsible. Nietzsche sees this as a profound narrowing of experience. The individual learns to mistrust their own instincts. They look outward for moral validation. Approval replaces achievement. Belonging replaces excellence. This inward pressure also produces a paradoxical relief, accusation. Condemning others momentarily relieves self-scrutiny. By identifying evil outside oneself, the individual experiences temporary moral clarity. Anxiety is displaced outward. This is why ressentiment cultures are often hyper-attuned to moral transgression. Outrage provides release. Judgment provides orientation. Accusing others restores a sense of righteousness that inner life alone cannot sustain. But this relief is short-lived. Because the moral system is universal and inward, accusation must be renewed constantly. New offenders must be found. New violations must be named. The cycle does not end. Nietzsche is careful here. He is not saying that moral concern is false or malicious. He is describing a structural dependency. When morality is built on ressentiment, psychological equilibrium depends on ongoing judgment. Over time, this produces exhaustion. The individual is morally vigilant but emotionally drained. Seriousness hardens. Lightness disappears. Joy feels undeserved. Even moral victory offers little rest. This exhaustion explains why ressentiment often shades into nihilism. When judgment can no longer deliver meaning, when accusation no longer relieves anxiety, the moral world begins to feel empty. Values persist, but belief in them weakens. Nietzsche believes this condition is widespread in modern life. People continue to judge, condemn, and moralize even as they feel increasingly disconnected from meaning. The structure remains, the vitality drains away. This is not a failure of morality in general. It is a failure of a morality built on reaction rather than affirmation. Ressentiment can sustain judgment, but it cannot sustain life indefinitely. Understanding this psychological cost is crucial because it explains why ressentiment does not remain a stable endpoint. It prepares the way for a more systematic response, one that promises to manage exhaustion by giving suffering an even deeper justification. That response is the ascetic ideal. But before we move there, Nietzsche closes the analysis of ressentiment by clarifying what it is not, and by blocking the misreadings that have plagued his work ever since. Nietzsche is acutely aware that his analysis of ressentiment invites crude and dangerous misreadings. Before moving on, he deliberately closes these escape routes. Ressentiment is not a synonym for compassion, morality, concern for others, or social cooperation. To confuse these is to miss the argument entirely. First, ressentiment is not the same as moral criticism. Criticizing harm, injustice, or cruelty does not automatically arise from ressentiment. Moral judgment becomes ressentiment-driven only when it is rooted in blocked action and sustained by inversion. when condemnation replaces agency rather than guiding it. Second, ressentiment is not weakness itself. Nietzsche does not equate lack of power with moral corruption. Powerlessness can exist without ressentiment. What defines ressentiment is not weakness, but the interpretation of weakness as virtue through moral inversion. Third, ressentiment is not empathy. Caring about suffering does not require hatred of strength. Ressentiment enters when concern for the vulnerable becomes inseparable from condemnation of those who are capable, confident, or forceful, regardless of whether they cause harm. Nietzsche is especially concerned to block the political misuse of his ideas. Ressentiment does not map neatly onto social classes, groups, or identities. It is a psychological pattern, not a demographic one. Both powerful and powerless individuals can be driven by ressentiment, depending on how they interpret their position. This is why Nietzsche rejects simple binaries. Ressentiment is not the many versus the few, or the weak versus the strong. It is the difference between reactive valuation and affirmative valuation. A person can be materially disadvantaged and still affirm life. A person can be powerful and still be driven by ressentiment. Another critical clarification: ressentiment is not deliberate manipulation. Those who live within it usually believe sincerely in their values. The inversion does not feel strategic, it feels moral. That sincerity is what makes ressentiment so effective and so difficult to dismantle. Nietzsche also blocks the temptation to treat ressentiment as merely historical. It is not confined to ancient priesthoods or medieval religion. It is a recurring psychological solution that reappears whenever action is constrained and meaning is threatened. Finally, Nietzsche insists that ressentiment is not something one can simply choose to abandon. It is not a moral failing that can be corrected by insight alone. Because it fulfills deep psychological needs, it cannot be removed without something taking its place. This is why Nietzsche's critique is diagnostic rather than condemnatory. He is not denouncing individuals. He is exposing a mechanism. His aim is not to shame, but to understand, because only understanding reveals what must be overcome. With these misreadings blocked, the full picture of ressentiment becomes clear. It is a powerful, creative, reactive force that explains how morality can arise from injury, and why such morality feels righteous, necessary, and universal. But ressentiment, left alone, produces instability, anxiety, and exhaustion. To manage these consequences, a more comprehensive system emerges, one that offers not just moral inversion, but a total interpretation of suffering. That system is the ascetic ideal. This is the bridge forward.